Margaret. Now resume.
Mr. Commissioner, we have today as a witness Mr. Michael Point from the Pacific Salmon Commission staff, the Chief Biologist of the Salmon Commission. He's appeared before you already in these hearings. When we first had Mr. LaPointe come and testify, I reviewed his qualifications orally, but we didn't mark his CV, which I think we'll do today. That document can be found, Mr. LaPointe, at tab 29 in the smallest of the binders. Yeah. This is just to identify for the record, this is your CV?
That's correct.
All right, and it sets out your education and some of the publications that you've been involved in writing.
That's correct.
All right, I'm not going to take you through that, but I just want it marked for the record, please. That's the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 328.
Thank you. Now, yesterday we had two members from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans here to talk about some of the pre-season and starting to talk about some of the in-season process in the year of fisheries planning and management. And I'd like to review with you from the Pacific Salmon Commission staff perspective some of those same areas. So I'd like to begin, of course, with the pre-season period. And there's a planning process that is undertaken by both the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the PSC, or the Fraser River Panel, in the pre-season. So I'd like to ask you what information or work is contributed by PSC staff to the pre-season planning process for Fraser River sockeye.
The primary work is the pre-season planning model, which I think we may be going into more detail later. We do facilitate, in cooperation with Canada, the estimation of these things called management adjustments, which I also understand you're going to have some sessions on in more detail later. But those are the two main things that we're involved with in terms of pre-season planning.
Okay. And then for the Salmon Commission's own work on Fraser River sockeye, I take it there's a budgeting and a planning process that's undertaken in the fall of the year prior?
That's correct. We try to alert the panel as to what our budgetary needs are, so they have a good idea about what programs they can expect in the coming year.
And just as a thumbnail reminder, I know we've covered this when you were here before, but what are the sampling and data collection programs that are run by the PSC?
There are a few primary ones: the Mission Hydroacoustics program, the test fishing programs, stock ID programs. Scale Lab is involved with also estimating age as well as stock, but it's those three primary ones, sampling that goes along with those programs.
And in the fall, your staff or the Salmon Commission would prepare a memo to assist in that planning process?
Yes, the staff prepare that memo for the information for the Fraser River panel.
Okay. If I could ask you to turn to tab 10, which is CAN document 01397967.
That's correct, I got it.
Okay, so we've been using 2009 as sort of a sample year to describe the planning process, and I should just let you know if there's something different that happened in the 2010 year, you can just alert us to those changes, but for just continuity, we're looking at 2009 as a sample year. So this document is dated September 22, 2008, and this is planning for the 2009 cycle?
That's correct.
Okay, could I have that document marked as the next exhibit?
Exhibit 329.
The only substantive difference between 2009 and 2010 would be that pink salmon are only migrating in the Fraser on odd years, and so obviously in 2009 we have a pink salmon program, and the even years we do not.
Okay. So if I can just look at that document, it outlines the test fishing programs, the scale and biological data sampling programs, pink, DNA analysis, catch monitoring. Also refers to the echo sounding program at Mission for sockeye and Hell's Gate observations for both sockeye and pink.
That's correct.
All right. And what's the purpose of this document? How does it assist in planning?
It really is just to alert the Fraser panel of our budgetary needs. There is a separate process that involves a commission level committee called the Finance and Administration Committee that actually formally approves our budget. but it's always good to have the panel aware of what we're doing, because quite often those Finance Administration Committee members would come to their National Caucus members and ask, do you guys know about this? Are you aware of this program? So it's just bringing the Fraser panel on board as to what our plans are.
Okay. And when does the Fraser River panel meet to discuss the planning process for in this case, for the 2009 year? When would that meeting take place?
The first primary preseason planning meeting would begin in February.
Now, we've been provided by Canada a document that it's a Fisheries and Oceans document, not a PSC document, but it's called a Record of Management Strategies document. Have you seen that?
Yes, and I have to say, from my brief glimpse through it, it looks like about 60 to 80% of that information was actually generated by us. And personally, I have some regrets having seen the magnitude of it. I feel a little bit like I may have given Igor too many body parts to choose from, but because it's quite a significant document. Yeah, I'm familiar with it. We facilitate it.
Okay. Well, because this document has decisions that have been made throughout the 2009 year, and it's all in one handy place, I'm going to refer to that document, even though it's not a Salmon Commission document.
Sure.
And I'll ask you to turn to, this is in tab 25, and for people's reference, it's CAN number 285372. The document that I have printed out, because it's some 600 odd pages, I only printed it once and it didn't have a CAN number yet on it, so I'll be referring to page numbers that are in the upper right hand corner of that document rather than the CAN page number. All right, so this document, if you turn to page 37, this shows it's dated January 23, but you'll see it references an agenda for a February 9 to 13 Fraser River panel meeting.
That's correct.
Is that the meeting that you were just referring to?
Yes.
Okay, I should, for the record, mark this entire document as the next exhibit, because we'll be using it quite a bit.
Exhibit number 330.
Okay. Can you just give us a summary of what, at that February meeting, what key information is received by the Fraser River panel, and what decisions are made in relation to the preseason planning process?
Sure. It's basically as outlined, particularly in agenda item number 2 there. The primary piece of information is the forecasts of both Fraser sockeye and Lake Washington returns. I think last year, for some reason, we may not have had that the Fraser sockeye forecast on our agenda in February. I can't remember why that was, but there was probably some delay or something, so that's why 2A doesn't have Fraser sockeye in it. The two parties have an opportunity to stipulate their conservation needs for other stocks and species. Things like coho would be a concern in Canada, for example, Thompson coho, summer chums in the United States. We have a formal process where we draft sampling request letters that go to each of the two governments for things that are outside what the PSC staff does. So an example would be Southeast Alaska fisheries sometimes catch Fraser sockeye, so there would be a request that goes to Alaska that says, could you please sample these fish for us? So that's what that item refers to. If there is any information that can be shared about the escapement plan that comes from Canada at that meeting, it would happen then. It's usually not finalized prior to this because there's a very extensive domestic consultation process in Canada, but if there is some heads up we can get about that into the bilateral, that happens then. Any policy options, in this case, there's something about late runs, would happen then. And then down the line, the test fishing programs would be initially discussed at that meeting. And in this particular year, we had some ongoing negotiations about the annex, and so there's an opportunity for the panel to bring everyone up to speed there and so forth. So those are the principal things.
Okay. Now, you said that the Fraser River sockeye forecast wasn't on this agenda, but that typically would be dealt with or would be received by the Fraser River panel either at this meeting or shortly thereafter? Yeah,
it's almost always at the February meeting, and I think it was probably related to the fact that the forecast methodology changed going into 2009, or maybe actually it was going into 2010, so I'm not actually sure why it wasn't on the agenda. There may have been some other reason, but it typically would be in February.
All right, and you mentioned that there was internal domestic work being done on the escapement plan at this time. Is there interaction between either the PSC staff or the Fraser River panel on the escapement plan developed by DFO?
There's an information exchange at the Fraser River panel meetings, and also it's not unusual in the workshops that have been occurred in association with the process that's called the Fraser River Sockeye Spawning Initiative, that FRISI process, as we affectionately call it. PSC staff and panel members and tech committee members have actually attended some of those workshops, but that would be the extent of the kind of bilateral exchange.
Okay. And you mentioned that you go over late run policy options and what's been done in previous years. Can you just describe what that's about?
There are two main paths that have been taken with respect to late run. Well, I guess maybe backing up before I talk about that, just so everyone's on the same page. Late run sockeye have been exhibiting some unusual behaviors that have resulted in them being a significant conservation concern, and I can go into more detail, but just as a way of context to describe why they're sort of singled out, I think I'll just stop with that sentence. But so as a consequence, the normal process of escapement plans hasn't always been used by the Fraser River panel, and they've considered two options in two categories. One of them is a exploitation rate approach, so a total fraction of the run that would be available for harvest, a limit on that fraction. The second one is to use the escapement plan that is developed by Canada and a management adjustment approach in combination. So those are the two categories of approaches. In the last 8 or so years, they've varied pretty predictably based on the cycle lines of abundance, so on weaver years. So that would be like the 2008 and 2009 cycle years, an exploitation rate approach would be used. And on the Adams years, which are the 2010 last year and next year, the other approach, the escapement plan approach, would be used.
So why is it discussed so early?
I think it's good. The reason that I tend to put them on the agenda for the panel in February is that it's good to remind them, okay, what kind of a year are we in? Is it a weaver year? Is it an Adams year? Because they're coming off a season where they have some memory of what happened, but they need to be reminded about, okay, we're going into this kind of a year, and in this kind of a year in the past you have done this. So it's to get that kind of mindset going, that they're thinking about, because it does take time to, as you probably have known better than you care to, there's a lot of technical detail, and so it takes a while to get the panel up to speed. And so that's the whole purpose, is give them a heads up. Hey guys, you're going to have to deal with this policy decision. You may not make it till June, but you better start thinking about it now, because it takes a while.
Okay. Work out the plan for start dates and end dates. When do you actually finalize the start and end dates for the test fisheries?
It has occasionally happened in February, but more often it would be in the April meeting. June is usually too late, because our first test fisheries would typically start around the 21st of June, so we definitely try to get it done by April. And the reason to get it in front of the panel in February is that there are budget processes within Canada that pay for most of these test fisheries, and it's kind of getting your stuff in the line for the funding appropriations that occur in Canada on that topic.
Okay. Are there adjustments to the start dates and end dates in season?
Definitely, there can be, and these are vetted through the Fraser River panel. We don't typically like to be paying for test fishermen to go out and test fish when there aren't any fish around on either end of the run, and the run timing varies quite a bit throughout the year, or between years, and so the schedule is a template, and it's very clearly understood that if the fish are late, we'll delay. If the fish are done early, we stop.
Okay. And on the draft inputs to that in some detail, but
sure.
Are you actually reviewing the planning outputs from the model at this point, or are you just talking about what needs to go into it?
No, we're trying to develop not the outputs, we're trying to develop the skeleton of what the inputs might be. So if we have the Fraser sockeye forecast, we'd have a table with those. If there is some notion about what the escapement plans might be without prejudice to future consultations, we'd put those together. Management adjustments would be based on historical values. Those are available in February. All of those things, timing assumptions, I probably in the past have frequently gone through some information, perhaps maybe the Gulf of Alaska is very cold and we might think that might generate early timing. Any of those kinds of heads up type things to get the panel thinking, we would try to get them to discuss at this meeting.
Okay. And then the next regularly scheduled meeting is in April, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And again, in the same volume, which is actually Exhibit 330. If you turn to page 48, this is the agenda, the draft agenda for the April meetings of the Fraser River panel.
That's correct.
Okay, and this is the meeting where you're likely going to make decisions on test fisheries, I take it?
That's correct.
Okay. What about pre-season planning? Is there work done on pre-season planning at this meeting?
Yes, this is the first time, the first meeting where there is bilateral preseason planning modeling done. So the two sides get together. It's usually a 4-day meeting. So this is the panel section. You can see the tech section, if you have the binder adjacent to it, it's just a subsequent page. Tech committee gets together and does 2 days of modeling, and then we get together with the Fraser panel and discuss those results. So the primary function here is to start that modeling. Just while I have it up here, I can see now there's a reminder of why the 2009 forecast wasn't on the February agenda, and it had to do with early steward. There were some changes that weren't finalized prior to February, and that's why I see this item 2A. So my memory has been tweaked for me.
Okay.
Appreciate that.
All right, so I'd like to now go to the pre-season fishery planning. Just as an overview, what are you planning and what are you trying to achieve? And then we'll go to some of your visuals that can help explain that.
Sure. In a general sense, the objective of the exercise is to start off with a set of management objectives, primary ones being spawning escapement. In the context of the treaty, there would be international allocation and also within each country domestic allocation. Is to take that piece of information about objectives and the information about the abundances of fish that may come back, which comes from the forecast, and some assumptions about timing, and ask what are different kinds of fishing plans that could be structured to meet those objectives given the inputs. So it's a scenario exercise in that it's not a single plan, it's multiple plans that kind of ask, what if the run was higher? What if the run was lower? How would we modify the plan? So it's definitely a scenario kind of a contingency planning exercise.
All right. You've prepared some documents that I hope will help make this process clear. They're at tab 21 of the materials, and they have a CAN number, CAN 285373. It's in
21.
tab 21. It should be in one of the bigger binders.
Sorry. I can look at this. This is okay. John's
Is that
faster.
okay?
John's faster than I am, so at least on this one he is. Honestly, Mr. Commissioner, I hope this is helpful too. I don't want to turn this into a technical committee meeting. Be aware of that, but I do think there's some important concepts here, which is why I'm very pleased that the council has agreed to allow me to use a few visuals here. So this first one is just describing kind of the scenario planning that I just mentioned, starting at the top with the assumptions that go in about abundance and run timing. And this whole run timing issue, I think, will become a little bit more clear to you shortly. So this just outlines what 3 scenarios might look like. The different columns there represent different abundances. So what's called 75 P level, at least in 2009, although I think the terminology has changed recently just to maybe confuse you guys, but it was a lower abundance level. The 50 P would be a median abundance level. So the concept there is that half the time you'd expect the run to be larger than that value and half the time lower. And then the 25 P level will be a higher abundance level. Each of those abundance levels, because Canada's escapement plan is based on abundance, in other words, you have to know the abundance to determine the escapement target, would generate a different escapement target. And similarly, and we'll talk about management adjustments later in more detail, the management adjustment, which is a factor that's related to the escapement target, that value would differ depending upon the abundance. So the things in yellow there are the management objectives I talked about. So going down to the next row there, you see international and domestic catch allocations. Those things all feed into the end product there, which are these fishing plans or schedules, if you like, which are going to vary. And I have some examples later in my visuals to show you how they vary relative to the abundance and the assumptions. Now, on the right-hand side there, just a note that this is a very simplistic view, and obviously we've got 4 management groups involved, and so I just didn't want to put that level of complexity on this particular graphic. That's really all I had to say about this particular one.
So the spawning escapement targets that you see on that document, are they are you referring to a management group target or a stock-by-stock target?
It's a management group target. Early Stewart, early summer, summer, and late run each have their own spawning escapement rules and distinct targets.
And where does that information come from?
It comes through from Canada, from DFO, through their spawning initiative process.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to move to the next page then?
Sure. So this is just the model inputs page, that top box that we talked about at the very beginning, which shows the abundance and timing assumptions. First thing you'll note on here is that there are more columns than the 4 management groups. So if you go across the top, you see early Stewart, early miscellaneous, Scotch Seymour, North Thompson, those abbreviations. Those 2, early miscellaneous, Scotch Seymour, are both early summer run groups. Similarly, late Stewart, Stalaco, Chilco, Quesnel are all components of the summer run group. And then everything else to the right there, Birkenhead, Harrison, and the late runs there are all in the late run group. The reason that we try to partition out stocks finer than the 4 management groups for this exercise is really related to the last row with some dates there. It doesn't really matter which row with the dates you look at, but let's look at the one that's highlighted in blue. That's maybe the easiest for everyone to find, the one with the dates. You can see that the early miscellaneous group and the Scotch Seymour North Thompson group had pretty distinct timing. They were about a week different. July 18th, July 25th. Everybody see that? So, and similarly, if you look at the late Stewart, Stalaco, and the Chilco, you can see there's smaller differences, but there are still differences. As it'll become obvious, I think, as you go through the next couple of visuals, when you talk about planning a fishery, you're putting a fishery in a specific location at a very specific time. So, the reason that if we have information that we can parse out, and the information for the numbers, the forecast, which is the first row, comes from Canada, and those are parsed out to 19 different stocks. There's 19 different stocks that are forecast. So it's easy enough to group them into these categories to get the sub-stocks that are shown here. But the timing is very important. If you're going to plan a fishery at a certain particular time, some stocks are going to be there, some are not. And so the degree that we have to split this up as fine as we can based on our historical data and knowledge allows the planning exercise to provide, for lack of a better word, and it's probably not the best word, a more realistic impression of what the potential impacts of a fisheries schedule would be on those stocks. If we aggregated the stocks and folks were concerned about the impacts on the early miscellaneous group, which includes stocks like Bowron, Nadina, we wouldn't be estimating those impacts very accurately. So even though there aren't specific escapement targets for those individual stocks, there is clearly concern. People want to know, if we can, what the impacts might be. And so this is our attempt to both do a better job of understanding the impacts on the aggregate, but also being able to provide additional information about particular stocks that may be of interest. Now, we have limited capability. I think there's 8 columns here, maybe 9 columns. The late run is a subtlety I won't go into. That in order to manage this migration behavior in the late runs, this is kind of the way we've done it. We kind of split it into 2 groups, and the pinks are there on the right-hand side. So you can see also at the bottom, we can toggle between different abundance levels. So that the different abundance levels are shown on the bottom there, and it's easy for us to toggle between them. And you can see that in this case, we've used the 75 P level for early Stewart, 165.
All right, and just to make it clear, the date timing line that you took us through was, it looks like A27 peak timing?
Yeah.
So what's the reference?
Okay, so the areas there, area 27 or 127 is the top end of Vancouver Island on the west coast. The typical reference point we use is actually area 20, which is the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And in fact, I think some of the next visuals I have referenced that. Area 11 is similar location to area 27, but it's on the Johnstone Straits side of Vancouver Island, not, north of Port Hardy.
Okay. And the run size information, that's derived from what data?
It's the preseason forecasts that are provided to us by Canada. And it's important to know or to realize that, yes, there is a point estimate, but there's also clearly a range. And so it's just important for us to understand the range. And by range, I mean, for example, the range of values shown at the very bottom, 3 rows, as it is for us to know what the median estimate is. In other words, that range tells us something about the uncertainty. And as you can see by looking at some of these values, I don't know whether I should, you can judge for yourself. There's a pretty considerable range, is what I would say.
And you've used a 75% probability for early Stewart and 50% probability for the rest.
That's correct.
And why was that?
Well, this is a representation of one particular scenario. So there were other scenarios in which it would have been explored where the 75 P level would have been used for all stocks. But the particular early Stewart issue with respect to 2009, I'm going to be stretching my recollection here a bit, but I think I'll have it right. There were data that were not used to forecast early Stewart that related to the juveniles, the fry, that suggested that the early Stewart forecast would be less than what the 50 P value was based on the information that was used in the forecast. And so in recognition of that potential bias, Canada recommended to the panel that they adopt the 75 P for early Stewart, and the U.S. concurred.
Okay, and then the inter-south diversion rate, what is that referring to?
That's a bit misleading on this table. There is a diversion rate. The diversion rate refers to in the case of south diversion rate, it would refer to the fraction of fish that come down the west coast of Vancouver Island and in via Juan de Fuca Strait, whereas the northern diversion would be the converse. The way that the diversion rate is handled in the model mimics what we think happens in that early Stewart almost exclusively come down through Juan de Fuca Strait. They're the earliest time stock. These are kind of ordered and left to right in terms of their arrival timing, and you can see by the dates. As the season progresses, the fraction of fish that come down through Johnstone Straits increases. That's pretty well happens every year. Where it ends up, an average, if you add up the run at the end of the year, it might be 30% on average come through 40%. So I think this 100% is just the starting point of the model. It's not the actual assumed diversion rate for the season, so it's a bit misleading.
Okay. The next slide.
There's a point in case you want to point to some of the numbers you're
Okay.
but you have to point to.
Okay, so this is where I have to really slow down, but I think it is absolutely critical that there's some basic understanding of the time-space dynamics that are going on in these fish, and it's very critical to understanding the harvest dynamics here and what happens and so forth. So what we end up doing with that piece of information that you have on the previous page that talks about the inputs and the timings is we take the preseason forecast, and this is an example for early Stewart, so you can see the preseason forecast of 165 there in the top right-hand corner, and we spread that over 30 days with the peak occurring on the long-term average peak of early Stewart. So in this particular example, when you do that exercise, you end up expecting of that 165,000 in total, about 10,000 would be expected to pass Area 20 or Juan de Fuca Strait in this case on July 4th. It's really not important that you understand the details of the shape of this run. I think if you ask any fisherman or anyone who's been around salmon, they'll understand that there's a period of time when some stocks aren't there. There's a period of time when there's a lot, they're very abundant, and there's a period of time later on when there aren't many there. And that's what this shape shows. That's all the real intent here. Now, what I've done is to get the space part of it. So this is the idea is that you're standing in Juan de Fuca Strait and you're looking out and you're getting an estimate of the number of fish that pass every day. That's the sort of frame of reference for this. So if you were standing there on the 4th of July, you'd say, I think I see 10,000 sockeye. We see them, so to speak, with our test fisheries, right? We don't actually see them. Okay, so anything that's to the left-hand side of that July 4th, those represent earlier dates, right? So that means those fish have already passed. You would have counted the number of fish in the black box there on the 3rd of July, right? And you would have counted the number of fish in that orange box on the 28th or 29th of July, whatever that lines up to. So those fish have already passed Juan de Fuca Strait. They're somewhere else. I don't know, I mean, you guys probably won't remember when Carl was here with me on the very first day, you know, and I don't know which exhibit, I'm exhibit 1, I'm not sure which exhibit his is, and John, I'm not asking to pull that up. But there was some information he had about migration rates. The fact that these fish swim about 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers a day, I won't remember exactly, it's not critical. So in these 30 days, if you're thinking about where these fish are in space, 30, times 30, there's probably a distribution of 900 kilometers in sort of a round number, right? So they're not all in the same spot. It's not like you're going fishing in a lake and all these fish are vulnerable in the same spot. That's why I've kind of built this diagram for you. So conversely, on the right-hand side, those are fish that are yet to pass the marine areas. So that green bar would be expected to be seen on the 5th of July at Area 20. So why is this important? Well, as I said earlier on, when you put a fishery, let's say you're going to put that fishery in Juan de Fuca Strait on the 4th of July, if you're going to have any capacity whatsoever to have some guess about what that fishery might catch, you have to know, one thing you have to know is how many fish are going to be there, right? Does it make sense? So the next graphic, John, if I could ask you to go to the next one, just puts those bars in space for you, okay? And it seems like I may have lost one on here. Where'd my orange bar go? How'd that happen? There it is. Okay, so the blue bar, Port Renfrew is the location of our test fishery. That's where the peak of the run is, okay? That green bar that hasn't yet passed Juan de Fuca Strait, it's somewhere up Vancouver Island, approximately 30 kilometers seaward of the peak, right? The black bar would have already passed, so it would be somewhere down Juan de Fuca Strait. And the orange bar, because those fish passed Juan de Fuca on the 29th of July, those fish would be expected to be estimated at Mission. It takes fish about 6 days to get from Juan de Fuca Strait to Mission. So the main concept I'm trying to convey to you is the fact that the space-time movement of these fish is very critical to understand the impacts of fisheries. So when we start looking at the fisheries schedules here in a few minutes, what you're going to see is something that looks kind of like a calendar. And maybe we can go to that now, assuming that people have kind of hopefully got the gist of this. I hope I haven't confused you. These are some of the objectives, model inputs. Other than abundance and timing, clearly we want to know what the spawning escapement goals are, and sometimes those can vary depending upon the abundance. They typically do. In the case of Early Stewart, they didn't, because it didn't really matter. It was a part of the spawning escapement rule where the spawning escapement target was the same regardless of run size. For the other stocks, you can see there is a tendency for the spawning escapement to be lower at a lower run size than a higher run size. The next row is this thing which we call the management adjustments. It's a factor that gets multiplied by the spawning escapement target. The late run factor is a bit counterintuitive. You would have to multiply the late run escapement factor by about 6 or so to get the ideal management adjustment, and there wasn't a big enough run to accomplish that. It's a little bit irrelevant in this context, only in the sense that the late run approach didn't use the management adjustment, it used an exploitation rate in that year. So it's there because it's always there, but it obviously looks like a number that's hard to understand. The next row is the Fraser River Aboriginal Exemption, something that's specified in the treaty. And it's parsed out to the management groups as shown there. Adds up to 400,000, which is the agreed amount in the treaty. The next set of rows is the test fishing. Those are what we would expect the test fisheries to catch given the plan. And clearly, if you're going to have a fairly similar plan, if there's more fish, like in the case of a 25% level, so each of these percentage levels, just in case I've lost you, refer to different abundance levels in the forecast, with 75 being a lower forecast, 50 being the median, 25 being higher. If you have more fish, you're going to catch more in your test fisheries, less fish. The next two rows are not really modeled bilaterally, but they're necessary in order to understand the impacts on spawning escapement. So in a notional sense, my understanding from what we receive from DFO is that approximately 750,000 fish in aggregate have been typically provided for Aboriginal folks in the Fraser River, and similarly 260,000 fish for marine folks. So we need to at least account for those potential catches because they're going to impact the spawning escapement. So that's why those are in there. Again, we don't explicitly model them, but they're part of the inputs. You can go to the next one, John, if you like. So here's that schedule I was telling you about. It's a little messy, I realize, but everything sort of most of the stuff on this table, it's labeled Canadian fisheries. To the left of that sort of red bar that's almost at the far right are the Canadian fisheries. So across the top, we have both gear. So for those who are not familiar, Area B is Seine. Area D is Gillnet, Johnson Straits. Area H is Troll, typically inside Johnson Straits, but also sometimes in Georgia Strait. Area E is Gillnet and the Fraser River. So those are areas and gear. And then down the left-hand side is the calendar. So it's putting these fisheries, or simulated fisheries, if you like, in space and time, which is why I spent all the time I did talking about the abundance varying in space and time, because what you're trying to ask is, if I put these fisheries in the water, what is going to be the impact on the fish that are migrating? I talked a lot about the early Stewart example, but you're going to have like 9 of these with different timings and different spaces and time. So in some cases, these fisheries are modeled as days. So you can see in area 20B down, if you go down, there's 5 days. And associated with that, and this is something that's relatively new, is a target catch. And this relates to this whole ITQ situation, which we can talk about more later. So in the case of Area B, it was being modeled as a quota. So there was a fixed catch expected to be caught that week. The 5 just tells us that we think that catch would be spread over 5 days. It would take them 5 days to get it. Area H Troll, similar thing, 40,000 target catch spread over 6 days. For the Area H Troll, we have 1 day per week there for that period in third week of July, and some expected catches for it. There isn't typically a lot of trollers that fish in Area H. It's sort of off Pender Bluffs here. You can see it from the, if you just go out and look off the point here, you can see some of these areas where the Area 18 is. Just
to interrupt for a minute, is that fishery a different kind of fishery than the ITQ fisheries that you've indicated?
Not the Area H fishery. It's just that we modeled it as a one-day thing. When you get to Area E, it is different. There you see half a day. So half a day Area E fishery, there would be some relationship that predicts the amount of catch you'd expect from a half a day's fishing in Area E. You can see that we penciled in river rec days there, and also some First Nations days. The only intent of those is to make sure that we're spreading those total catches out so that we're counting for the impacts on the stocks in question. There's no negotiations or discussions that happen about how many days the rec fish will be open or how many days the First Nations fisheries will be open at this meeting. That's all done domestically. Typically the rec fishery, I think, is open for a period, like from some date to another date.
Right, now we haven't had a lot of time yet in the hearings to talk about the different type of fisheries, so just to make sure everybody's on the same page, just can you explain the difference between an ITQ and the Area E, which has the 0.5, just very thumbnail, because I'm
sure. So the fundamental difference, there's a lot of things with economics which I don't think is germane, but the most germane things is that from a fisheries management perspective, there's a target catch. So they're fishing to a catch.
This is the ITQ.
ITQs, yeah. So that's these fisheries that are modeled with catch numbers here. They go out with however many boats they think they need to take that target catch, and when they get that target catch, they're done for that week. The contrary example would be the Area E fishery that has been typically referred to with the words derby style fishery. There, the level of control is related to fishing time. So the idea is you have half a day. Whoever has a license for Area E can show up and fish, whatever that fleet size is. It's a few hundred boats. And they catch whatever they catch in half a day. It's very competitive. Guys try to, some guys like the derby style because they think they're better than the other fishermen and they can do better. Some guys prefer the ITQ. It paces things. There's yings and yangs. The ITQ is a relatively recent phenomenon. In fact, it's been in the planning stages for 2 or 3 years now. 2010 was the first year it was actually executed. It was the first year we had enough fish to make it happen. But those are the concepts broadly.
Right. And the derby style one, how much fish you expect can be caught in an hour or a day, and you use that to plan here?
Yeah, we have historical data. I will say quite honestly that not so much for Area E, although it is true of Area E, but certainly for Area B, and for many of these fisheries, the fleet sizes have changed quite significantly, mainly in the downward direction. There's much fewer boats involved now, say, than 15 years ago. And so we're continually updating these data. So we might have had historical data 15 years ago that might tell us what half a day fishing in Area E would catch, but it's the more recent stuff that we pay much closer attention to because fleet sizes have changed quite a bit. All right, I don't know how much more I had in this, John. I guess there is more.
The next, I guess, if you turn 2 more pages down, this.
Oh yeah, so this schedule that you just showed was for a bigger run size, the median run size, I should say. Big and small is probably not a very good descriptive term. The next schedule shows this what would be needed to meet objectives under a lower run size. So you'll see that there's fewer days. In the case of Area E, they're trying to fish for a quarter of a day there down that column there. And you can see that the quota catches are much smaller, and that's because there's less fish around.
Okay.
So again, just to show the contrast, there's different scenarios.
Right, and then what is this used for by the commission? You have one more page that may help answer this question.
Yeah, so we
take
take all of these alternative runs, and those 2 fishing plans represent 2 of them, and generate this summary table for the Fraser River panel. And so this is bilaterally reviewed. The columns that are on the top are things that we discuss. What would be helpful for you to see in terms of helping you understand the consequences of different fishing plans and different scenarios. So those are the indicators. So things like this DBE thing, we're going to talk about this later. All we're trying to do is account for the fact that the number of fish in the spawning grounds is not just going to be due to how many are caught. It's going to be due to how many make it to the spawning grounds. And as we'll talk about later, we know that there's been significant en route losses in some of these years, and so we're trying to account for that en route loss. So it's how many fish do we expect on the grounds? The numbers in parentheses are the actual spawning escapement targets as a reference to judge the outcome of the model. US and Canada TACs are obviously of great interest to the countries. The actual catches, so that the first 2 are their shares, the next 2 columns are their actual catches in the model. And the total catch is the total catch in all fisheries expected under that model run. There are the exploitation rates, which simply mean the fraction of the total run that's caught. And then there is this number that is the potential spawning escapement, the difference between the potential spawning escapement. So the potential spawning escapement would be the number of late runs that would occur if the only source of mortality was the catch. If you compare that number to the number that's the 3rd column over there, so 456 in that top row versus 53, the difference between those is what the anticipated en route loss would be. So even though some of these plans may have different impacts, so for example, the 75P in the second 2 rows with respect to the potential spawning escapement of late runs, there's about a 80,000 fish difference between the 457 and 370. Look at the difference between the expectations on the grounds. Almost 50, 49 versus 46. The reason those comparisons are different is because the early upstream migration of late run sockeye has resulted, I don't know what the prediction was in this year, but something in the order of 80, 90% mortality, right? So when you start multiplying some of these values by a number like that, you get quite a different result. So these are the pieces of information that the bilateral panel looks at. Some of these model runs just relate to different scenarios of abundance. Some of them may relate to different timing assumptions or management adjustment assumptions. Some of them may, one of the countries may ask, well, if we catch our full share, how much difference does it make to some of these outcomes than if we go strictly right to the, escapement constraints? They never, in my experience, and I've been doing this now for 20 years, pick a model run to agree on that doesn't achieve the spawning escapement targets. But they sometimes want to know what the implications are. Hey, if I did, what would it mean? How many fewer fish? So that's kind of the intent of this exercise, is to give them some scoping of the potential scenarios, particularly on the fisheries planning side. You can imagine, you guys haven't all lived this like I have, but in the heat of the summer, we're going 100 miles an hour. And so to conduct a what-if exercise in the middle of July or something is almost impossible. So that the degree to which we can do that kind of what-if probing in the calmness of April or June is really important, so that if we encounter that situation, and sometimes we don't always encounter, like I can tell you right now, no one thought 2009. We didn't plan a model run in 2009 with what we saw in 2009. Well, it would have been a pretty easy model run, because had we gone through that exercise, we would have known that the fishing plan would have been a bunch of zeros. I mean, because it was so low, right? I mean, it was so extremely low. But quite often we may be close on one of these scenarios and say, well, it's kind of like this one that we did. And that really provides a valuable frame of reference when you're trying to make these fisheries decisions on the fly in the middle of the summer while the information is changing every day and so forth. Yeah, so I just took that model run in the second row there, and I'm not going to go through this for you unless you want me to, but each country asked for more detailed model output, and so they each get about 5 or 6 pages. And sometimes each country wants different things. I mean, this spreadsheet that is this model is something like 8 megabytes, and I don't know how many tabs there are, but there's got to be like 30 or 40 or 50 tabs, so you can kind of get the picture if you're used to dealing with Excel about kind of the magnitude of this. And so these are all different possible outputs that they would have. The only one I might point your attention to, this deals with kind of goals and models, but the one, I think it's the next one, John, maybe the next page. Let's see, total run entering. Yeah, okay, so I think this is the one. Can I just see the next one, please, just to see if this is, where the heck is the page I'm looking for? Maybe the next one, let's try the next one, and yeah, I think this is the one I'm looking for. Yeah, okay. So the reason I brought this one up is to kind of speak to the primary objective and mainly to focus in on the spawning escapement. So if you look at the net escapement it's the second row with numbers on this table, that's the net escapement target. Okay, so it's the same numbers that were in one of the model inputs page. You look at the very, very last row, net escapement after subtraction of MA, second to last row. That's the actual expected spawning escapement. And the reason I brought this up is that we've encountered this issue a number of years now, a number of times where we've had very low returns. The total run of early Stewart in this analysis, in this forecast, was expected to be 165,000. Virtually all of those fish were required for spawning escapement, 156,000. See that? The actual total catch in this model run was only about 10,000 peaches. See, it's the number right above the second to last row. 10,000 fish were caught. 80,000 fish were expected on spawning grounds. What's going on? You know, there's probably no other salmon fishery that you'd see in the world that would have that kind of an outcome. Like usually you would just take the run, and you subtract the catch, and that would be your spawning escapement. So one of the subtleties within the Fraser sockeye is that we have this thing we call the DBE. There's some anticipated en route loss. So even though the exploitation rate was only 7.6%, that's shown on the bottom here, only 7.6% of this run was caught, we only ended up with 81,000 fish expected on the spawning grounds because of the management adjustment. Now, I don't know how you characterize that. I mean, 2 words that come to mind for me are like mission impossible. You know, how do you do that? It's not achievable because there's an element of the management that's outside your control that relates to the impacts of these fish in the river that causes your escapement target to not be anywhere near what you would have hoped it would have been. If we have enough fish and we can add to that escapement in total run and we can add to that escapement target in the total of the management adjustment, we do. But when your escapement target is the total run, there's no more fish that you can put towards escapement than the total run. And this is going to come up in the in-season data for 2009, which is why I flagged it here, just to let you know right away that there was a very, very clear understanding that even if we had no fisheries on early Stewart in 2009 and the run came back at 165,000, we were not going to see what the escapement target would tell us we should have on the spawning grounds. And I think it's one of these subtleties of Fraser that is important in the context of thinking about evaluating, management performance. So that's why I wanted to highlight that for you, Mr. Commissioner. And that's all on this detail. I really don't have anything more to say on this particular set of visuals.
All right. The only other question, this calculation table that you see here, is this a scenario or is this a final document?
This, I believe, represents the second row of the summary sheet. I don't know which model run that was. It may have been the one that was adopted, but it is a scenario.
If you can go back, Mr. Lund, to PSC Sockeye Fishery Model 2009 as a header, the different area fisheries that are shown there and the different allocations that go to each fishery, how are decisions made as to those percentages? How do you how do you get that information?
Those are what we call domestic allocations, and those sharing percentages are given to us by Canada as to what their agreed domestic sharing arrangements are. So those goals are based on the percentages that were provided to us by Canada times the available TAC.
All right, so part of your task when you do these fishery plans is to ensure that the percentages given to you by Canada are met in terms of the fisheries that are suggested to be implemented.
Yeah, it's a very, there's a lot of slices of this total pie that have to try to be achieved.
Okay. And in terms of what is given to the Fraser River panel, I take it all of the stuff that we've looked at today, plus many other versions and scenarios, would be looked at by the technical committee, is that right?
Yeah, I can recall some years where we may have had in the 20s and 30s in terms of possible model runs. It can be quite extensive sometimes. I would say, though, that some of the briefing materials early on is not typically provided to the Fraser panel. Most of them have been around long enough it's kind of intuition, so that's more for you guys' benefit. I think I did that originally for the think tank scientists in 2009. The only things that a Fraser panel probably hasn't seen are the first 3 pages of my visuals, the sort of box diagram and the little movement thing. One other comment I'll make before we leave this is that you may have heard the term boxcar in describing the modeling approach. And that is really germane to those visuals I showed you. The concept is that you've got a train. Each train has a day's worth of fish. And every day that you go through, the train moves down the track one. That's where the boxcar term actually comes from. And another reason why the boxcar term is used is that we have this thing we call the order of movement assumption. And the idea there is that if you're in a train, the cars can't change their position. In other words, the caboose can't be up near the engine unless something really catastrophic happens. So if you run into those terms in your reading, that's where it comes from. It's the idea of the day's worth of fish moving along. Every day, chink, goes, abundance moves through.
I'd like to have that whole presentation marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit number 331.
Dave, that exhibit you're speaking of, Exhibit 30 was the record of management strategies, which was that long document.
Right. This is a different
Right.
document.
I'm just not sure I know what it is you're marking.
It's the presentation that Mr. Lapointe just went through that
Okay.
began with the sort of a flow chart was the first page and ended.
Is there a cover page for this document?
It's this is the beginning of the document.
All
It's
right.
been presented in this way. It's a series of slides that were prepared by the Salmon Commission staff.
Okay, just bear with me. So that's Exhibit 331.
Right.
Could I just ask 2 quick questions on what Mr. Lapointe just referred to? One is, you may have mentioned this, Mr. Lapointe, but how much input does the Fraser River panel have into the creation of these models that you've been addressing?
The specific model I'm talking about is got to be, I think it celebrated its 25th birthday this year, if you can believe it. So there was quite a bit of input at the time. It has evolved significantly, and actually I just recently recruited a new staff member to give it a bit of an overhaul and a modernization, I guess is what I would say. But yet they are frequently asking us things like, well, why can't it do this? Or could you make it do this? It's a very much a familiar a familiar thing to them.
Okay. And the other question I have is, and you may be coming to this, so you can put it off if you're coming to it.
Sure.
How much alignment, and that's my term because I've heard that word used by the witnesses, is there in the model for the wild salmon policy?
Well, I can try to speak to it. I guess you saw the extent of the stock separation. There's 8 or 9 different aggregates that are modeled. Those would certainly be far fewer than the number of CUs that are currently being identified. And off the top of my head, it's got to be 20. I won't know the exact number, but it'll be 30 or 40 or exact number of CUs. So there isn't alignment there in the sense that you don't have every CU modeled. It would be difficult and to model each CU, not because we don't know, well, there are 2 reasons. One is we only have forecasts for 19, so that's one constraint. The other one is we don't have the detailed knowledge of the timing of each of those individual CUs. So I guess the short answer would be not terribly well aligned based on what I just provided you.
Okay. Thank you.
The Commissioner asked you about whether the Fraser River panel was involved in the model development. Just following up on that, what about the inputs into the model? Do the members of the Fraser River panel have any contribution in terms of run sizing, allocation? I mean, escapement goals, a lot of these things that we've talked about, those originate with others than the PSC. Is that fair?
They originate primarily with Canada. I'm sure at some point when allocation policy was discussed, there was some discussion on the part of folks that would be affected, but there's no annual renegotiation of those kinds of things. It just is provided to us by Canada.
Okay, and at the April meeting, is there a decision to be made on these preseason fishing models?
No, it's the first run through, and we get together in June, and a lot of that relates to the fact that some of the inputs are still in flux. So there is a linkage to the timeliness and the approval of Canada's IFMP. So Canada would be very reluctant to agree to a final model run in April if they still have ongoing consultations on some of these things that are going to be finalized and fundamentally signed off by the minister usually in June. So this is sort of a trial exercise. Okay. Came to my mind, Mr. Commissioner, with respect to your question on the wild salmon policy, the linkage, one linkage would be through the escapement plan, and I know you're going to have a session on, I think, the frizzy process. But there is an attempt to at least model a finer scale than the 4 stock aggregates within frizzy in terms of some of these benchmarks, but it is restricted, as far as I know, to the 19. So to the extent that the escapement plan reflects some analysis of the potential impacts on those 19, then there is some incorporation of that information because we use that escapement plan.
At the April meeting, is there a discussion of late run policy options again?
Yeah, if there's any debate or it needs to be finalized, we definitely would discuss it again in April. They pretty much have a hard time getting that one off the agenda until they figure it out.
And is it finalized at the April meeting, the late run policy?
It depends. There have been, I think, some meetings where it has been, but typically it wouldn't be finalized till June.
And this is the final meeting for preseason planning, is that right?
That's correct, unless we need an extraordinary one, which is rare. There have been the odd ones.
All right, if you turn to page 63 in the Record of Management Strategies, which is Exhibit 330, that has the agenda for the June meeting. So what are the decisions that need to be made at the June meeting?
The June meeting, the primary decision is an agreement on a fishing plan. That agreement results in 2 documents primarily being prepared. One of them is called the Principles and Constraints, and the other one's called the Guidelines for Addressing Late Run Concerns. The fishing plan provides a very rough template under one scenario of what the schedule might look like if that scenario materializes. The Principles and Constraints will frequently have statements that say if the run sizes are different, fisheries may start later or earlier. It's a very, very broad template, but it forms the basis for the next set of steps, which is the regulatory control process that turns over the formal regulation of the panel waters from the governments to the Fraser River panel.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that document in a minute.
Sure.
What about decisions on management adjustments? Are they made at this time?
All part and parcel of the agreed model run. There has to be an agreement on the preseason management adjustments. At this meeting, typically we would have a long-range forecast of environmental conditions, which would be provided to us by Canada's Environmental Watch Program. And we would use that input, which is typically two things, flow, river flow, and river temperature, as inputs to determine the management adjustments for the early Stewart, early summer, and summer run sockeye. And then for late run sockeye, if we are using a management adjustment approach, it would be based on their anticipated upstream timing. So definitely management adjustments pre-season wise are finalized, but then of course in season we adjust them as we see the river conditions change.
Are adjustments related back to Canada for use in the IFMP, or what's the relationship there?
I presume they are. I'm not involved with the consultation process or preparation of that particular document, but I know that they're well coordinated, so I presume they are.
Okay, but the management adjustments for Fraser River planning is determined by the panel at the June meeting?
That's correct.
Okay. And I take it they're updated in season as need be?
Yes.
Okay. Does the Fraser River panel have any role in determining the probability level that will be used in planning?
Yes. The treaty states, and I won't be able to remember the paragraph in Chapter 4, that in the absence of guidance to the contrary, and when I say guidance to the contrary, it would be by bilateral agreement, the panel will use the median value, the 50p level. However, as occurred in 2009, Canada or the United States can recommend a different value, either higher or lower, and they can adopt that value as per bilateral agreement. So in this case, they adopt a lower value for early Stewart, for example. I've not ever experienced them adopting a higher value, but it is at least technically feasible for them to do so if they so choose.
And the late run management decision is also made at this time?
It's finalized at this meeting, yes.
And is there a relationship between a decision made by the Fraser River panel on the approach to the late run sockeye vis-a-vis the IFMP? You know, could you ever have a situation where you have a different decision at the Fraser River panel than you would see in the IFMP?
I don't think so. There is an important thing to recognize with respect to cultus sockeye. So when we talk about late run management approach in the Fraser context, we're talking about the late run aggregate, and as I think we may get into later when you look at some of the in-season stuff, sometimes Birkenhead has been parsed out of that, and I can explain that why later. Cultus sockeye are, as you know, have at least been assessed by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, COSWIC, as endangered, although they were not legally listed, is my understanding. And so they're a special stock of concern to Canada. In Canada, the United States clearly can't exceed its aggregate late run objective, but there is no specific bilateral sharing of the cultus objective. In other words, the obligation for achieving whatever the agreement is on cultus, if it's a 12% exploitation rate, falls on Canada, taking into account whatever the expected impacts on the aggregate late run, including cultus, would be by the United States. So that I don't know the history of all of that, except that I would say the treatment of cultus in the Fraser context is very similar to the treatment of ESA listed stocks in the United States. So the United States legislation is the Endangered Species Act for other species like an ESA listed Chinook or coho. So it's a parallel treatment, so I think that's perhaps why the treatment is the way it is. But the main point here is there isn't a bilateral objective specific. In other words, the United States doesn't get, quote unquote, a share, if you like, of cultus sockeye in terms of what they're allowed to catch. They're restricted by the late run aggregate, which does definitely restrict them, but they don't get a specific share. And I just think that's a kind of important distinction to mention here.
That is actually earlier in the binder that we're looking at, the RMS 2009 document exhibit 330. If you turn to page 19, this is the principle and constraints document that's agreed to at the June Fraser River panel meeting.
Yep, that is the one. It's initialed by the two chairs. That is the one.
Okay. And what is this document's purpose?
Very broad statement of the agreed assumptions. So, for example, talks about, in a general sense, the forecast expectations there in the first point. Talks about the priority of objectives that the panel is going to manage. So it's a bilateral understanding of the broad skeleton of assumptions and objectives that the panel is going to manage to bilaterally. It documents, okay, here's what we're going to do, okay? So that there's no, it's not detailed, but on the fishing plan, it really only specifies when fisheries, the very first fisheries in panel waters might start, and that's down in that regulations section there under item number 5. So you can see it very broadly says that, if you get close to the 50p level there, you'll expect fisheries to begin around the 19th of July and that week, but obviously that's subject to change. We're going to get to the regulatory control letters shortly, I think, and I need to make a point about that, but I don't need to talk about that here. So, again, very broad context about the assumptions and what we might expect.
All right, and I take it, as you say, these are assumptions, and they're not binding. If the scenario doesn't track at 50% probability and doesn't come in when expected, then the panel has some flexibility to adjust.
Yes, and maybe I should just say it now. The most important thing about the regulatory control letters, and I don't know if you have examples of them, it's maybe not important that you do, is that the philosophy is closed unless open. In other words, everything is closed. You start the season, and in fact, I remember these weren't shared that much with panel members before I used to start to include them with the panel, and one of the panel members came up to me and said, wait a minute, what kind of fishing plan is this? It says nobody can fish anywhere, anytime, until the panel says, well, that's what it says. It's closed unless open. And so what this is saying is that if we have abundances near these levels, you might expect the first openings to start in the 19th of July. Now, I suspect if you talk to fishermen, they might have differences of views about that closed unless open, but that is clearly understood. It is closed unless open. And that is another important reason to bring that up, is that if you go back to the IPSFC years, some of those gray annual reports that used to be, that you probably have on your record, is actually quite different. It's a schedule. It says it's closed unless open, except seine fisheries will be open on Tuesday for this time period. Gillnet fisheries will be open on Wednesday for this time period. And that approach meant that there were some regulations that were, for lack of a better word, sort of cast in stone going into the season. And the only way that the fishery schedule could be changed, so for example, if you didn't want to have a fishery that you'd already scheduled, you had to have an extraordinary meeting and emergency measures. That is not the way it happens now. Since 1985, closed unless open.
References are 68 and 69, if you want to just pull one of those up for an example.
The annual reports for the...
No, the regulatory
control letters. Okay, yeah. So you can see these statements here, like, no person shall commercially fish for sockeye or pink salmon between the 28th of June and the 19th of September. So this is what I'm saying when I first showed this to a fisherman. He was a little surprised about this being our fishing plan, as you could probably imagine. And so, did you want to talk about these in a general context at all?
I just wanted to flag those. All right, and the fishing plan that's adopted through the modeling process, again, that provides guidance to the panel when the season begins. Is that fair?
Yeah, it provides a bit of a context. The main thing it's used for pre-season is to ask whether the information is consistent with the plan in making those very first decisions about the very earliest fisheries. And because those earliest fisheries that are under consideration are what the word is that's used is low impact. I probably should describe what low impact means, but an example would be a fishery off Nia Bay in the United States. It's a fishery that's conducted by members of the Macaw tribe. There are 4 or 5 gillnet vessels involved. Daily catch in the hundreds, although they did actually quite well last year. But it's very small fisheries that the consequences of a mistake in opening those is fairly low because their expected catch is low. That's what we mean by low impact.
Okay. Mr. Commissioner, it's 11:15. I'm going to move to a new document, so.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.
Officer.